Last sermon, we focused on the first of the dangerous prayers taken from Psalms 139, entitled, "Search me, O Lord." From this prayer, we learned that the cure for a safe, lukewarm prayers that focus on maintaining a bubble of spiritual safety is to approach God's throne of grace, not with mere platitudes of self-indulgence, but with honesty, with desperation, with fierceness, with unrelenting faith, and unbridled spirit-led power to boldly ask God to search and to reveal whatever's in our hearts. David prayed this prayer. I can only imagine the results that he got from it. It was a very bold prayer to ask God, I need you to search me and show me any places in my life where I haven't given it over fully to you, God. And I want you to show me them and encourage me and give me the strength to confess my sins and to get back on the right path. Not an easy task to do. Not something that we do, a kind of prayer that we give without really thinking it through. If this wasn't difficult enough, though, King David then asked God, lead me. Lead me on the right paths. Don't just help me get rid of my sin, which is incredibly important, but David said, once the cup is cleaned and the house is all nice and clean, then show me how to fill that house, my life, with you, Lord. Teach me how to walk in the right path. Teach me how to follow you, God, in everything that you want me to do. Teach me in the way of everlasting. David said, I know ultimately, God, by praying this prayer, he said, I know there's a possibility I'm going to change eternity, probably even shake hell, scare a few demons along the way. But at the same time, David understood, I'm going to get trials. I'm going to get tribulations. I'm going to get suffering. I'm going to get incredible persecution. But, and there's that wonderful and beautiful but, David says, I'm going to get unspeakable joy of chasing after God and His kingdom. In the following sermon, we're going to look at the second of Groeschel, his dangerous prayers, and it's called Break Me. This is based on Jesus' breaking of the bread in 1 Corinthians 11:24. My name's Reverend Derek Gildert. I'm senior pastor here at McKees Mills Baptist Church. I got up this morning, I looked outside, and it's snowing of all things this time of year here in Canada, which is unusual, but I know it's only temporary. I do love the change of seasons, and all the seasons are an awful lot of fun to go through, and they all have their highlights. So I praise God for the day that He has created. I hope and pray throughout this prayer that you open your hearts and your minds to what is about to be said. I think ultimately our prayers do get too comfortable at times, and I do believe that we've got to try to give more dangerous, but I guess more thought-provoking, more spirit-led, more surrendering prayers to God that mean something. In other words, God, yes, I want you to help me with the basic needs of my life. Absolutely, that's a good prayer. Yes, God, I want you to help me with the people that are all around me. I want you to help them with their needs in their life. That's a good prayer too. But I think we got to go one step further and say, God, I want to change. God, I want to be more like you. God, I want you to mold me, shape me, transform me on a daily basis so that I might look like you, act like you, and talk like you, the best that a human being can. That's a dangerous prayer. And this is where Groeschel, the author here today of Dangerous Prayers, his book, Craig says this, he says, we got to be willing. We've got to ask. We got to look and say to God, I'm willing to pray a dangerous prayer. So let's look at Break Me, because this is one of the ones that when I read it in the book, I went, now that's bold. That's a really bold prayer. You think Search Me was bold? Break Me is even more bold than the first one. Oh Lord, break me. Break me in my pride. Break me in myself. Break me so that I might serve you and only you. Break me while it makes me perfect sense, ultimately, to pray for safety, for comfort, for a whole bunch of other things. You know, God, please help me not to have too many struggles. God, please help me not to have too many hardships. It seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it, for us to get on our hands and knees and say, oh, by the way, God, break me. Oh, no, I'm very interested in helping me in my daily life. But at the same time, God, I want you to break me. It is a bold request that we give unto God. Not one that we should take very lightly, but I think one that's necessary for us to grow spiritually. And I find this in James. Consider it pure joy. Oh my goodness, here James goes. Now you got to understand the author. This is one of my favorite authors in the Bible. James is very pointed. James does not use flowery words. James does not use politically correct terms. James just comes out and says the truth as it is. He's a very bold writer. And I love that about James. So you don't have to worry about what James is trying to say here. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete and lack absolutely nothing. So James is trying to tell us ultimately that it's through our struggles, our trials and tribulations, that spiritual growth occurs. This is the way we usually grow. It is fine to pray for the safety and the blessings, but if you want to see the Spirit's power perfected in weakness, then break me is the prayer that we ought to pray. After having opened a new church, Groeschel's mentor, Gary Walter, he gave him the following promise. So think about this for a moment. You just started a brand new church, and now Groeschel, Craig here, it was a very young man at the time. So he starts this brand new church. And of course, that's got a lot of challenges. When you start a new church plant, of course, you got to worry about a whole raft of things, like where are you going to get the people and what place are you going to actually be in and how are you going to get your all of your church organized and everything else, and how are you going to get new people in? And there's just a raft of questions. And here he is, he's trying to start this brand new church. He goes to his mentor, and his mentor tells him, okay, I'm going to give you some advice. And of course, Craig's sitting back, okay, he's on, the edge of his seat, and he's saying, all right, here it comes. This should be really good advice. This guy, I really look up to him. And this guy, Walter, looks at him, Craig, straight in his eyes and says, oh, by the way, I have a promise for you. He says, well, what's that? He says, God is going to break you. Can you imagine how you would feel? In response, Craig admits he had betrayal in his face. He was hurt. He was confused by what his mentor said. He wasn't very happy with the statement that God was going to break him. So his mentor went on and he quoted A.W. Tozer to help Craig understand a little bit about what he was saying. A.W. Tozer said this, "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he first hurts him deeply." Isn't that something? Let me give it to you again. It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly, a man or a woman, until he has hurt him or her very deeply. I think that's absolutely true. Gary reminded Craig that out of love, God would do what was necessary to break him of pride, self-confidence, self-sufficiency, and anything else that might be an idol in his life. Craig shared his advice with the members of a small church. He was quite excited about it. He wasn't really sure if he should accept it. He was excited to hear it, absolutely. He looked at the advice from A.W. Tozer and from his mentor and said, you know what, is there some credence to this? So he takes it to his church. Can you imagine going to a church meeting and say, oh, by the way, my mentor and A.W. Tozer, they're both saying that we should pray for God to break us. Can you imagine how that went? He took it to his church, but most of the people responded the same way. They were too scared to ask God to break them. One by one, they opted out of praying for such a prayer because they could not help but think about God. They were thinking about His sovereignty. They were thinking about His power. They were thinking more likely about the 10 plagues of Egypt and what God can do to them. And they were sitting back saying, I'm not really sure if I'm comfortable with the idea of saying, God, break me, because I know He can. And I know He can break me in ways that are just absolutely brutal. So I'm not sure if I want to say, God, break me. So most of them opted out. They said the cost was too big. They would rather live a life without pain and discomfort in their lives rather than pray to God, oh, by the way, break me. You know what? They were keep praying over and over again. God, please help me. God, take pain out of my life. God, take discomfort out of my life. God, make my life easy. But they weren't willing to say, God, help me. Break me first. Break me so that you might help me become more like you. Would you pray that prayer? I mean, I'm very comfortable with praying, God, help me. God, restore me. God, make my life easy. But are you willing to pray the prayer, God, break me so I might consider it pure joy when I go through trials and tribulations, and so that I might, according to James, persevere and mature and become more like Jesus? Are you willing to pray that prayer? For most people in his church, Groeschel admits, no, they were not willing to pray the prayer. Not at all. They were actually quite scared of it. I got thinking about a story that gives in the Bible. And it's a beautiful story about somebody who was broken. And in the process of breaking, they actually had something much greater released. You know what? In playing it safe, Groeschel states that we are missing out on something far more precious than our security and comfort. For when we are broken, something is released within us, this maturity that James is talking about, that is far more valuable than any kind of pain or suffering we might go through. For example, let's look what happened when a woman crashed Jesus' party at one of the Pharisees' houses called Simon the Leper. Think about this. This woman, she was known as basically a lady who lived a sinful life. Now, if we go back into the ancient times and we look up the sinful life, how did people use that term? And we find out that's just a nice way of saying she was a prostitute. So here she is, a lady who's known amongst the community as somebody who sells her body. And she crashes. She comes into this dinner party and she says, here I am. I want to go and honor Jesus. Of course, everybody's looking at her and going, wait a minute now. The tradition of our time says no woman is allowed to come into the dinner party except to serve. They couldn't just come in and barge in and say, here I am, I want to join. That wasn't allowed. But this woman did it anyway. She came in and said, I must see Jesus. She broke with the social customs of the day in which women were not allowed to attend the formal dinner. And she got there and she took an alabaster jar, a very expensive perfume, and poured it on Jesus' head. Now, think about this for a moment. In scriptures it says this jar of perfume would cost approximately 1 year's worth of wage. Now, think about what you make in a year. Can you imagine taking 1 year's worth of wage and putting it in the offering plate? That's tough. I don't know about you, but I would have to really struggle financially for several years, I'm sure, if not much longer, to actually get back on my feet financially if I did that. But think about that for a moment. This lady took that perfume and she broke it on Jesus' head, and that would have been a year's salary. There's another part of this, though, that I don't want you to miss. This perfume could have been a heirloom. If it was given down from her family, and it was very, very precious. There's another value to this perfume. But other scholars say this, and Groeschel points this out. He says, most likely, it's part of the tradition that we got to look at to understand a little bit more about this perfume. Back in those days, most people could not afford perfume. Very, very few people. Only the richest of the rich could afford perfume. Nobody else could. So, what Groeschel is saying here is that the ladies, those who sold their bodies, would actually be able to afford to get this perfume, and it was a trademark. It was something they used to advertise. Since nobody else wore perfume at that time except the extreme rich, this lady would put a little bit of perfume on herself, and then she would walk amongst the crowd, and once they smelled the perfume, the men would know that they could hire her and have sex with her. This was part of her marketing. When she broke that perfume bottle over Jesus' head, most scholars believe that ultimately that was her saying, I'm done with my old life. Break me, oh Jesus Christ. Break me, break me, break me. Get rid of this bad habit in my life. It doesn't sound like a really big deal, but ultimately it really is. Groeschel suggests ultimately their act of breaking the bottle of perfume was not just an incredible act of worshiping Jesus, but was also represented her desire to forever give up her past association with the profession of going out and prostituting herself. She was all in. She was all into the kingdom. In other words, Jesus, I want to serve you. It was precisely in her brokenness that Groeschel suggests that she was able to totally surrender her life to Christ, whom she had given her heart at some point in time too. This is powerful. So for this lady, it was in her brokenness, the breaking of that perfume bottle, the breaking of that profession, that ultimately she was able to get rid of her shame. She was able to get rid of her old lifestyle, and she was able to get in front of Jesus and actually start to grow in the faith. That's huge. Hang on to that thought, for Groeschel's going to come back to that several different times. We're going to go on to this. This is the breaking of the bread. And this is where Groeschel points to the main thesis of this section of his book when he talks about a dangerous prayer called Break Me. While they were eating, Jesus took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and he gave it to his disciples, saying, Take it. This is my body. Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. This is the blood of the covenant which is poured out for the many. You know, this is a beautiful example of brokenness releasing something extraordinarily precious. Jesus broke the bread at the Last Supper. It was symbolic. It meant an awful lot to us. At this symbolic meal, we are told the following. While they were eating, Jesus took the bread and he gave thanks and he broke it. And he said, you know what? This is my body. It's going to be broken. It's going to be broken so that I might atone for the sins of humanity. Mark 14:22-24. In the breaking of the bread, Jesus was symbolically showing ultimately that he would be broken, he would be bruised, he would be crushed, he would have stripes across his back, he would get brutal scourging, he would be pierced, he would have a garland of thorns, he would have nails both in his hands and his feet, he would be crucified, he would be separated from his Father, and he did all this, why? Because he loves us. He loves us. He atoned for our sins, so that we might have life and might have it abundantly. Yes, in the breaking of Jesus, the breaking of his body, that is. Yes, something great was released. It's called love. It's called mercy. It's called grace. It's called atonement. And that is so beautiful for us. Imagine, though, ultimately how Jesus must have felt knowing that Peter had denied him 3 times and that Judas ultimately betrayed him while he hung on the cross. Jesus willfully allowed humanity to spill his blood so that he might pay the debt for our sins because he loved us so very much. Jesus said we are to break the bread and drink the cup in remembrance of him from now until he returns. What does that exactly mean? You know what I think part of it means? That we should attend communion every month, at least, or every week if you want to. There's no set time, but we should repeatedly go back and celebrate the Lord's Supper over and over again to remember the sacrifice that Christ gave. Absolutely. But is that enough? I don't think it is. I think remembrance, and I think Craig is right when he points this out, he says remembrance ultimately has to be more. Because Jesus Christ's body was broken, because his blood was poured out for all of us, we too should live for him daily, broken and poured out. It should not be something that we remember once a month, if that's your tradition, or once a week, if that's your tradition. It should be something we remember every day. We've got to remember that Jesus was broken for our sins, and it's given us a beautiful right. I should say a privilege more than a right, a beautiful privilege to serve inside of his kingdom. Well, this sounds painful. Jesus said if we want to be his disciples, ultimately, we do need to be poured out. We need to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. We need to have our focus on God's kingdom and not on our own. We've got to have our goals and our dreams and our aspirations and our desires must be not just for us to survive, but us to thrive in God's kingdom. This is important. Sounds awful painful, doesn't it? But the riches are there. Jesus is not inviting us to a life of spiritual safety. No, he's inviting us to one of surrender, sacrifice that will turn into pure joy, as James says, the closer we get to him. If we want to grow spiritually, then we've got to give up the life we cannot keep. We've got to get in front of God and say, look, God, break me. Break me if you must. But I want to get rid of anything and everything that keeps me away from you, God. And I want to become more like you. That's the break me. Let's take a look at this little guy here. I like this. Anybody remember the Jack in the Box? You know what? That was a little toy I had when I was growing up. And I remember it was a little bit of a scary toy. It wasn't necessarily something that you looked at and said, ooh, that's kind of cute. And it was a little bit cute. But you know what? You take the little lever, and you can see it on the side, and you take the top lid and put Jack back down inside the box, and you close the lid, and it would latch. And then you'd turn this lever. And this lever would eventually, you'd never know when, would release that top of the lid, and Jack would jump right up in the air, and he'd scare the bejeebers out of you every time. You know what? This creepy music, of course, while it's going on, or at least it seemed creepy, would play. And in great anticipation, you'd be waiting for that lid to fly open. You knew it was coming. You knew that it would fly open. But it didn't make much difference that you knew it was going to, because every time that it flew open, it always frightened you. Not frightened you, but startled you very quickly. It is this point that Groeschel returns to the promise Gary Walter made, his mentor. Remember his mentor said, God's going to break you, Groeschel. And he said, okay. Remember, Groeschel had a really hard time with that. He said, oh my goodness, you got to be kidding me. God's going to break me? Yes. Okay, well, let's go back to that. You know, as he's going through this little small church, of course, he's growing, and they're having all the struggles you would expect from a small church. And as bad things happen, which they inevitably do, challenges that is, he'd go back to his mentor, and he did several times, and asked him, Walter, am I finally broken? And of course, Walter would tell him, nope, not yet. He went back several more times, and he said, okay, I got a new problem inside of the church. Walter, am I broken now? And of course, he said, nope, not yet. And then his mentor, being very wise, told him, oh, by the way, he said to him, Craig, when you are broken, you will know it. There will be no question. You will not have to ask me. So anyway, he thought about that. Okay, fair enough. So Groeschel tells us his heart-wrenching story. And it certainly is a heart-wrenching story. He says this fellow, a friend of his, ultimately decided that he would come and move to the city where Groeschel was pastoring at and join this little church that he was starting up. And anyway, he really loved this guy. They got along great. They were very best friends. And of course, they're getting along great in the ministry. Everything's going beautifully and fine. Then one day, this friend of his, he does something that's very defensive. He does something that's wrong. Something, and you know, Craig never says what it is. But he says he did something that was absolutely 100% wrong. He shouldn't have done it. So Craig approached him and said, look, that's not okay. You shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. Instead of the guy saying, I'm sorry, and apologizing and saying, you know what, I'll make that right. And yes, I agree with you. That wasn't right. I can do something about that. Instead of doing that, he got very defensive. And we often do that. We don't want to give this guy a hard time. We often get defensive when somebody looks at us and says we're not doing the right thing. So this guy got very defensive and started yelling. And of course, the two of them yelled back and forth. And of course, a fight breaks out between two best friends. Groeschel says he's not surprised that next week, this fella, his best friend, is not at church. And he's not surprised next week he's not at church either. He had made no attempts up to this point to actually reach out. Neither one of them did. To reach out to each other and say, let's meet together. Let's deal with this. Let's talk about this. Let's get back to being best friends again. He finally decided, after a sermon that he did about forgiveness, he decided that he was going to go and basically call up his best friend and say, look, let's meet. Let's deal with this the right way and let's become friends again. I miss you. So anyway, he makes a phone call. And he gets right ready to pick up the phone. He's got the number in his head and he's ready to dial it. And he goes and looks and he says, oh, there's a message on my phone. And its little light is blinking back and forth, back and forth. And he goes, okay, I better answer that first. Then I'll call my best friend. So he goes and hits the answering machine and he gets this response. And it's his Jack in the Box, in essence. Because what happens is the wife of his very best friend, she's in tears and you can hear her crying on the other end of the phone. And she says, I got really bad news. This fella, my husband, your very best friend, has committed suicide. He never had an opportunity, Groeschel didn't, to actually say, I'm sorry. They never had an opportunity to mend the fences. They never had an opportunity to work through things. When that answer machine started to talk and the wife of his deceased friend is sobbing, that was the Jack in the Box. That was the Jack in the Box. It popped up and he said, oh my goodness. In that moment, Craig says, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt God had broken me. I was broken. He was so broken and he was so sad and it was more, not just so much that his friend died, that was heartbreaking enough, but the fact that they left on very bad terms, the fact that the last thing they said to each other was yelling back and forth, that crushed him. How he wished he would have went back and basically made a phone call a couple of weeks earlier or the day after the fight or something like that. But you know what? You can't think that way, can you? Hindsight's a beautiful, wonderful thing. So exhausted, overwhelmed, scared, shattered, and absolutely beside himself, Walter was right. Groeschel had been broken. Absolutely. And it was a situation that was absolutely brutal in his mind. I want to talk about being blessed by being broken. Groeschel says he still remembers the day. He went in front of this small church. And of course, they're shattered too. This was a prominent leader inside of the church. He was a co-leader along with Groeschel. And of course, the church is absolutely sad. But Groeschel is devastated. He is broken. He goes in front of the church and he starts to cry. Can't even hardly get the words out of what has happened. And he starts to cry in front of all of them. And he says, I need a prayer from you. I need so much more than just you to tell me a little bit of a prayer. I need a hug. I need you to work with me. I need you to show me love. I need you to show me grace. I need you to show me friendship. I need you to lift me up because right now I can't. Right now I'm hurting. He was absolutely shattered by the suicide. And the fact that his last words were harsh, he just didn't know how to get over it. And he said, I needed my church family to help me heal. To heal, Groeschel knew he needed the support of his spiritual family. What was revealed to Groeschel on that day was breathtaking. He said, I'll never forget it. What is broken also releases something else, is what his mentor told him, what A.W. Tozer said. And ultimately it was true. For after he prayed that, asked that request in front of the church, with tears in his eyes and with great brokenness, the church supported him. The church grew. And he said no longer was this church anymore a gathering of people. Now this church was a family, a real grace-filled community, because they supported and loved each other and learned how. Just as persecution always unites, strengthens, and emborders people, I think ultimately Groeschel says brokenness can create a bond that will stand the test of time. It can bring people together if we help and support each other. In our brokenness, we often experience the greatest of God's blessings. It takes tremendous faith to pray, God, break me. But how much spiritual maturity and opportunities to serve God do we miss out on when we pray for and live our lives in the safety of our own self-preoccupation? Way too much. If Paul had refused to suffer greatly for Christ's name's sake, Acts 9:16, he would have missed out on 3 glorious missions, and he would have missed out on the opportunity to tell kings about Jesus Christ. Wow, that would have been an opportunity missed. If Peter had not experienced the shame of denying Christ 3 times, only later to be restored and reaffirmed by Christ, would he have given such a glorious and beautiful message on the day of Pentecost about forgiveness? I don't think so. Peter lived it. He was broken and yet restored, and he wanted to tell them all about it and how you could be restored through Jesus Christ. That's important. You know what? We are each called, I think, to be broken, to be poured out daily. 1 Corinthians 15:31. So that we might depend on God's Spirit as our comfort, our guidance, and our source of power. While praying for God to break me is certainly a dangerous prayer, it's also an invitation for God to adjust our hearts and guide our steps in our weakness. So whatever we do will be through His strength and the praise for His glory. So I want to finish with this. Would you dare pray that prayer? Break me, O Lord. Would you dare? It's a tough question to ask. It's not an easy one. So I hope and pray. I finished a little bit early in this sermon. I didn't take up my full time. I hope that you'll take the time now to go and be by yourself and go ask God, am I ready, Lord, to pray that prayer? Do you have the courage? Do you have the strength? Do you have the willingness to say, Lord, break me? Because I want to be more like you. I don't want to just play it safe. I don't just want to have you, Lord, take care of my needs. I still want that, of course. I don't want you to just take care of my friends' needs. I want that too. But ultimately, Lord, I want to be transformed into your image more and more and more every day. And if that requires persecution, if that requires strife, if that requires me to go through difficulties, then break me, Lord, break me, Lord, break me, Lord. Is that a prayer you dare give? I leave you that challenge. Groeschel is certainly hitting the mark when he says, search me, O Lord, from King David. And then he goes to the Lord's Supper and he says, break me. These are really tough prayers, but very beneficial ones. So I leave you with that challenge today. May God bless you today, and I hope and pray that you spend some time asking God, break me.